Welcome to an IELTS writing video. In this video we're going to look at IELTS writing part 1 academic. We're going to look at a line graph. So just to start with, I got this IELTS task from a Google search, but the original is from a Cambridge practice tests for IELTS books. I'm not sure which number because it was just in it. Okay, welcome to a video, an IELTS writing part 1 academic video. We're going to look at a line graph. I got this from a Google search. I went into Google and put IELTS writing part 1, fish and meat. But all the results there are the same, and they're from the Cambridge practice test for IELTS books. So I definitely recommend, if you're preparing for the exam, you want to get hold of these books. They're very good for practice. Okay, so what do we need to do? The first thing is not to look at the graph. Step number 1 here, look at the topic and think about your experience. So let's just underline the topic here. The graph below shows the consumption of fish. So we're talking about the consumption of fish and some different kinds of meat. So it doesn't tell us which kinds of meat. We'll see that in the graph. Maybe you don't know the word consumption. What do you do if you don't know the word consumption? It's pretty easy. You take away the word and you guess what it means. So it can mean two things. It can mean the production, how much is made or caught, or it can be how much is eaten. You probably can guess that it means eating. So how much fish and meat is eaten? Number 1, what's the topic? What's your experience? So I'm going to write here, the topic is eating fish and meat. And then you need to think about like your individual experience. So what's my experience with eating fish and meat? Well, interesting enough, I eat a lot of meat. Which kinds of meat? A mix really. I don't have a lot of beef now. In Australia I used to have a lot of beef, not so much now, probably more pork now. And chicken as well. I eat more chicken than I used to because apparently white meat is a little bit healthier than red meat if you want to eat it often. When it comes to fish, as far as fish is concerned, regarding fish, concerning fish, I never used to eat fish, but now I actually eat fish maybe once a week, perhaps less. I want to eat more. Fish is quite nice and it's quite healthy. Okay, so that's my experience. You can see that you know, a lot of chicken, more chicken than I used to, less beef than I used to, more fish than I used to eat. That's my individual experience. The next thing you need to think about is the place, the people. And then you need to guess what it's like in these places. So what's the place here? It says the place, the people, number 2, it's in a European country. So this is where we play the stereotype game. European country. So it's not a specific country. We don't know which one. But we know it's not Asia, it's not in the Americas. So what stereotypes do you have of a European country? It's difficult, of course, because I guess that in places like Portugal, Spain and Greece, on the sea, they probably eat a lot more fish than people in, for example, Germany do, or Switzerland. Maybe I'm wrong. But we need to think of, okay, a stereotypical European. So they probably eat a lot of meat as well. I think Europeans like to eat meat. And probably not so much fish. Probably. I'm guessing, of course. This is a guess. Okay, so that's my guess. The next thing to think about is the time period and whether or not you think this goes up or down. So in number 1, when I talked about my experience, I said that, you know, my fish eating has gone up, my beef eating has gone down. So we need to do the same thing for this time period. Let's have a look, underline the time period there. So the time period is between 1979 and 2004. So it's fairly recent. 2004 here is fairly recent. 1979, that's what, 25 years? That's almost one generation. So the question you ask yourself, in this European country, how has consumption or eating of fish and different types of meat changed over one generation up until more or less now? Not quite. Okay, so I'll just put here a lot of meat, not much fish, generally speaking. Okay, time period, up and down guesses. Well, I don't know really. I guess that fish hasn't moved, not moved much. Then we think about the different types of meat. I think meat went up. So I was talking about my consumption of beef went down and consumption of chicken went up. I'm not sure. I think that the different types, they all went up about the same. Okay, so fish, I think, is going to be fairly low and not move a lot. However, the types of meat are going to go up, generally speaking. Okay, so now we have our own picture of what the graph is. Why do we do this? The reason why we do this is when you see the different picture, it makes everything much clearer when you compare it with yours. So let's have a look at the picture itself. Okay, so we're looking at the picture now. Again, I just took this from Google Pictures. Obviously, someone in Japan took this from the Cambridge IELTS practice test books. So let's compare. Yeah, there we go, fish. There's fish. So interestingly enough, it's different from my consumption. My consumption went up, but I did guess that in this European country it wouldn't change much, but it did. It did go down a little bit. Okay, so this is what we're thinking about coming back to the checklist. We need to look at the time period, and we need to think about what went up and down, and what was the highest and lowest. So what went up and down, what was the highest and lowest? Coming back to the graph, we can see that fish went down a little bit, and it was the lowest. So we've got our fish there. Okay, now what are the types of meat? Yeah, we've got chicken, and we've got beef, and we've got lamb, and wow, that's very different from what I thought. My guess was that, you know, they would go up, up, and up, and by similar amounts. But we have something very, very different, because these two here, they go down. Beef and lamb go down. So, whereas chicken goes up. So that's interesting. Like my consumption of chicken went up, and my consumption of beef went down. I didn't talk about lamb. Now I think about it, my consumption of lamb is less than it used to be. So, wow, I'm like a typical European. This is amazing. Okay, so again, don't forget the time, 1979, 2004, and be very careful what's here. What have we got? Grams per person. This is important. This is important. Per week. Now you need to react to this. So again, you think, okay, grams per person. How many grams do I eat? Let's say of chicken. I don't know. Maybe 300 grams or something like that of chicken. So let's have a look. Wow, I'm up here. Woo! I eat 300 grams of chicken. I probably eat of beef on average, what, 50 grams or something like that. So I'm down here for beef. So I'm a lot lower. Lamb, I'm a bit higher actually, because I do have a little bit of lamb. It's probably about 200. Okay, there's my lamb. So for beef, I'm lower. For lamb, I'm higher. And for chicken, I'm much higher. Okay, because I'm thinking about grams per week. This is why it's important to react. It's very typical. As an IELTS examiner for 10 years, and I saw like over 1,000 writings, it's very typical for people to forget about this part here. You know, the graph shows how much chicken, beef, and lamb. You know, they talk about the fact that people ate 200 grams of chicken. How much did they eat at the beginning? Yeah, over 200 grams of chicken at the beginning of the period. But 200 grams of chicken per week, per day, per month, there's a big difference. So that's a fairly important piece of information. We need to include all pieces of information. Okay, so we've compared our picture to this picture, and the next step is to then think about the key points. So let's have a look at a checklist for this. Okay, so when you've looked at the graph, the first thing to think about naturally is where you write. Did you guess? If you're wrong, it doesn't matter. The next thing, we've got here IELTS 6, IELTS 7, and IELTS 8. And this just shows what's typical. People who get an IELTS 6 for how they answer this question, they typically do this, but they don't do what people who get a 7 do, and people who get a 7 don't do what people who get an 8 do. So what do people who do a 6 do? They do, what are 2 to 4 key trends or features? So again, we're looking for what was the highest, what was the lowest, what went up, what went down, what was similar. So let's go back to the graph there. And okay, so we can say, let's look at some features. So fish was always the lowest, it went down. Lamb, you know, it was what, the second place one, but it went down to be the second last one. Beef was the highest one, but it went down to be the second highest. And chicken was, again, a middle one. It went up quite a lot to be by far the biggest. Okay, so we need to think about this. It's by far the biggest here. Beef, for example, here it wasn't by far the biggest. Okay, but we've got our main trends there, like 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got 4 features. That's the first step. The second step, can you logically group together any of the trends? Because someone who gets a 6, they give the key trends, but they just put them without thinking about which ones go together logically. Let's look at our graph again. And we can see that obviously beef and lamb, they go quite well together. So I'm actually going to delete that one there and put that as number 3, because number 2, I'm going to group these together. So these ones here can be very logically grouped together. Beef and lamb, that can be 2 there, because they follow a similar trend. Okay, and then to get an IELTS 8, what do you need to do after that? What order is best in the 2 body paragraphs? So in your writing, you're going to have your introduction, you're going to have an overview, maybe a separate paragraph maybe in there, and then you're going to have 2 main body paragraphs. So we need to decide, okay, we've got these 3 points, which ones are going to go in which paragraphs? So it makes sense to put beef and lamb together in one paragraph, and then we can put fish and chicken in a separate paragraph. Okay, and then think logically. Think logically. So, does it make sense to put beef and lamb at the beginning in the first paragraph and then talk about chicken and fish? Or does it make sense to put chicken and fish and then talk about beef and lamb? To me, it makes more sense to put chicken and fish first, because the main one is that chicken went up by quite a lot, and we can contrast it, whereas fish did absolutely nothing. Yeah, and then we can talk about, the 2 other ones that moved. There is no 100% correct answer. For example, I could easily say, well, I'm going to talk about, let's say, beef and chicken. Okay, because for most of the graph there, starting from here, okay, and then all the way around to the end, beef and chicken were number 1 and number 2. So I could start with my first body paragraph and say, beginning with the ones that dominated throughout the period, we can see that they are chicken and beef. And then we can talk about chicken and beef, and then we can talk about the 2 less popular ones together. So we can group these 2 here. We can group lamb and fish together and talk about that. And then that would make sense, because we could start with chicken, and then we could compare it to beef, and then in the second body paragraph we could then say, well, lamb was quite similar to beef. The other 2 that were mostly the bottom 2, lamb was similar to beef in its movement, and then you could do a little bit of contrasting with the previous paragraph. So yeah, I think I might write my essay like that, because it will take a little bit of skill. So that's something you need to think about. If you're finding this very difficult, then perhaps you want to choose a fairly easy way to organize it, which might just be, it might be to look at, lamb and beef are quite similar. So then you don't have to contrast that much. The one that I'm going to choose, where I talk about chicken and beef, and then lamb and fish, I'm going to have to contrast a lot between paragraphs. But this is good. This is good because then you can show skill. Okay. So what order is best? That's a subjective question. This one here, I feel that the second one is better. However, some other people might feel the first one's better. It doesn't matter, you can choose either.